I'm Jon Sibley, CEO of Centre for New Energy Technologies, or C4NET. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, the third in our series, moving towards a whole of system approach to energy planning in Australia. Today's webinar, Getting Charged and Ready, Placing Consumers in the Driving Seat to Power Up the Grid, is all about EVs and the adoption of EVs right across Australia, but in particular in the NEM, and the impact that that's going to have on all of us as consumers and also as energy users and those within the energy system as planners and deliverers of that power. Today's discussion is designed to spark conversation and to share valuable insights into not only the EV adoption and the outlook for how that will grow across Australia, but also the consumer value and the grid integration aspects of that. The role of V2G technology, or vehicle to grid technology, and insights into the planning challenges that all of this brings. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. Today, I am on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to their elders past and present. So why are we so interested in electric vehicles and discussing consumers being in the driving seat to power the grid? The transition to electric vehicles is a massive change. We're right at the front end of that curve now. Yet we're already seeing some little pockets of concentration being in there. Energy Queensland recently reported a suburb with over 14% electric vehicles in there. There are things that we can see right out to the end. We can plan to the end. We can plan to 100% adoption. And there's some things that we can pretty confidently predict in there. This will impact policy settings or influence policy settings and need for good policy settings, for planning, for infrastructure, and the way we buy and use electricity. There's a whole lot of knowns and unknowns, and we'll explore those today. Some things are pretty certain. Other things, such as how we use electric vehicles, pretty unknown at this time. But what is unmistakable at the moment is that the shift is on. Global supply chains in vehicle manufacturing are moving from internal combustion engines, or ICE, over to electric vehicles. The pace at which we move in Australia to adopt the electric vehicles will depend on policy settings, will depend on consumer preferences and driver preferences, etc. But what is almost certain is the entire shift from ICE over to electric vehicles. And it's a once-in-a-lifetime infrastructure shift. So let's think of it's the undoing of the petroleum side, the exploration, drilling, the shipping, refinement, distribution, retailing, and putting that onto the electricity system. And the good news is a lot of that electricity infrastructure is already in place to be able to deliver it. And certainly at low numbers now, we can do that with very minimal impact. But as we move towards 100%, it really starts having a very, very large impact. I'll come to that in a moment. But what impact we have will very much depend on how we use our electric vehicles and integrate with the grid. And for that, consumers are definitely in the driving seat. We look at the integrated system plan put out by AEMO. We look out towards the sort of 2050 type timeframe that's there. It's 21 million electric vehicles across Australia. Now, at C4NET, we're looking in particular at an enhanced system planning project at the moment, which is looking at the distribution impact or the impact of electrification on distribution systems. In doing so, we're really focused just in on Victoria at the moment. So just to illustrate those numbers, that's around 6.3, that 21 is 6.3 million of those electric vehicles are in Victoria alone. That's 300 to 400 gigawatt hours of electricity storage adjacent to our grid, much the same as Snowy 2.0. And a 2.4 kilowatt charge, that's around 15 gigawatt of power compared to right now, the peak for the state's probably around 4-ish gigawatt. The scale is massive. Now, of course, that's not all. We're not all connected at the same time. We're not using the grid at the same time. I know that. But what it does say is even relatively small percentages of electric vehicles being connected to the grid can have a very, very large impact. If we all switched over today all of our cars were electric vehicles, that's the equivalent of doubling the number of houses on the grid today. It's a really big number. And consumers will own the biggest asset that can be connected to the grid. They'll collectively own that. They are very much in the driving seat. All of this change means we need good planning. These are long-term assets. They're expensive assets, the infrastructure assets to support electric vehicle charging. Very much we want to see policy, market structure, and regulatory settings aligned to give us that best possibility of the best outcome that we want. There's a whole lot of different scenarios that could play out. But we have the capability of looking forward and being able to plan for those and somewhat influence or choose which ones we go to. Too small, too big, too fast, too slow. They all have their costs. And we also know the cost of retrofit is typically much higher than good planning and getting it right from the outset. Consumers will probably love the lower fuel costs of owning an EV, and chances are the convenience of being able to charge at home, destinations, and how that leads to a change in their behaviour. Who knows? Maybe too, the ability to engage with the electricity system in a different way, either through scheduled charging or through vehicle-to-grid type technologies and powering back to the home. That will only happen if things are favourable for them. They're very much in the driver's seat. And I've started painting a picture right out to 2050 and everything and what that might look like. But today we've assembled a group of panellists to help us talk through how do we get there from where we are today and what are some of those challenges. Rango from the EV Council is going to talk us through the EV uplift. What are we hearing from consumers? What are those policy settings and how are things moving in that outlook for Australia? Sayani Gupta has the enormous challenge of being one of the lead analysts for AEMO in wrestling this EV cloud of possibilities down to the ground into a sensible group of numbers that we can work around to help plan what that means from an integrated system plan point of view. Likewise, Erceg will join us from AusNet Services to do similar, but from the perspective of a distribution network service provider or DNSP. Not only do they have to consider the long-term assets that are in there, but also their changing customer behaviour and how they serve those customer needs. And then Jon Sibley from NX will share some insights into the world of V2G and how that uptake can happen, what some of the barriers are in place currently, and how we're progressing to removing those. The concept of us all having a lot of storage sitting in our driveway, really, I've seen it be quite a challenge for a lot of people in the energy sector, even well-versed veterans of the sector, and just the world of possibilities that starts bringing. Okay, so let's get on with it. I'd like to introduce our first speaker then, Rango.
Thank you very much for hosting to C4net. Much appreciated for the opportunity. Per the introduction, my name's Ross. I'm from the Electric Vehicle Council. I head up energy and infrastructure work there. Some opening remarks relating to the consumers and the uptake of EVs. We're at approximately 250,000 plug-in electric vehicles on our roads today. These are vehicles that consumers largely have already bought and are already plugging in around the energy system. We expect that over the course of the next 30 years, the vast majority of vehicles will go to plug-in electric type. There is a future where people hang on to the old V8 Holden Commodore on club plates, but that'll be a rounding error in the total fleet rather than the bulk of the vehicles. To James's point earlier, the quantum of energy involved is huge. If we waved a magic wand and turned all of the vehicles on the road to electric today, we would need about 40% more electrical generation than we currently have. So 40% more electrical energy than we currently use as a country in order to displace the 30 billion litres of petrol and diesel that we currently use in the road fleet. In dollars terms, we go through about $50 billion a year worth of petrol and diesel in road transport. If you took typical domestic electricity pricing for the equivalent, that's about $20 billion a year worth of electricity. The scale is large. At the consumer level, about 100,000 EVs were bought last year. That's approximately $5 billion worth of consumer spending on the vehicles that are enabling the transition. And in terms of where we're at in this transition, we talked about a target of 20 million total vehicles on the road, and we're up to about 250,000 of them so far. If this were a marathon, we would have just passed the first half kilometre, with the other 39.5 kilometres yet to go. We are very much at the start of the journey. I'm going to talk a little bit about the consumer perspective on the energy side of this before I throw to the next speaker, and obviously very keen to talk about V2G after Jon's been on the panel afterwards. The EVC's produced guidance for consumers around this, particularly around when that energy is consumed. The quantum of energy that the driver needs is going to depend on their driving behaviour, but when they charge their car, when that energy is delivered from the energy system into the vehicle, will have a huge effect on the energy system as a whole. Our guidance to consumers, simplified, is charge in the middle of the day if you can, because that's when the solar generation is at its maximum. That's the greenest and cheapest and most grid-friendly electricity. Charge in the middle of the night if you can't. So if you're driving around all day because you're an Uber driver, for example, and you're not stationary in the middle of the day to charge your car, please charge in the middle of the night. And please, for the love of God, don't charge at 5 or 6 in the afternoon on a hot day when we need all of that energy network capacity to run our air conditioning and our other systems. We survey drivers too. So we did a survey at the start of this year of 1,500 EV drivers, and we posed them a three-way question relating to what they are willing to do with regard to charging their cars. We asked them, do you want to pay full price and charge anytime you like? Would you like a 50 to 70% discount and keep control of your charging, so schedule it yourself? Or would you like to have that discount and hand management or control to a third party? Please rank the choices. And what we see is on the left-hand side of that chart, a very small fraction are saying, I'll pay full price and I'll charge when I like. About half are saying, I'll have the discount and I'll keep control. And there's a large minority who are looking for someone to orchestrate the charging for them. And this carries through. You see the retail offers in market from the likes of AGL and Origin, for example, where there's offers that are time of use, consumer controlled, and there are offers where there is orchestration in play. But then when we look to the right-hand side and we ask the consumers, right, that's what you want, but how many of you are actually getting a discount? What we find is that 3/4 of the consumers are not aware if they're getting a good price for their electricity for EV charging. And that points up a gap in consumer awareness and education. So as the Electric Vehicle Council, and we're certainly not alone in this, we built a thing. It's a retail comparison tool that's on our website, shows you where the deals are that will give you electricity at less than 10 cents per kilowatt hour in the middle of the night without imposing too much of a burden at peak time. The deal's got to be good for the consumer to make our list. It's not acceptable to have a very low price in the middle of the night paired with a massive increase at peak time, because under a deal like that, the consumer is likely to be better off on a flat tariff, and that isn't going to send the signals. The eagle eyes in the audience might notice that regional Queensland and Western Australia are greyed out. They're greyed out here because in those regions, there are no particularly good deals for EV drivers with respect to, can we meaningfully shift the behaviour? And before I throw back to the rest of the group for the next piece, an example from Dataland. This is what charging behaviour looks like in Queensland on the peakiest of days, the 22nd of January this year, where Queensland hit a new record for peak demand. They hit 11 gigawatts that day, up from about 10 gigawatts the year before. The red line here is consumers without solar and without EVs. This is residential consumption, midnight to midnight on that day. And on that very hot day, you can see demand climbs from about 6 in the morning all the way through till 6 in the evening. You don't have the duck curve on a day like this if you don't have solar on the roof. What you've got is steadily increasing demand as it gets hotter and hotter and hotter. The yellow line is a home without an EV, but with solar. So there you see demand starts to fall away at about 6, 7 o'clock in the morning as the sun comes up. Solar generation outstrips domestic demand, so we have export into the grid on that yellow line from the solar consumer. And then in the evening, as the sun goes down and the heat stays present, demand from the grid rises. Not quite to the level of the home that has no solar, but it rises to a demand rather than a contribution to the grid. The blue line's the really interesting one. The blue line is the consumer with solar and an EV. That consumer is exposed to price signals that shift demand away from peak time and encourage demand in the middle of the day. So you can see in the center of the chart an uptick in self-consumption in the middle of the day, reduced export from the home, increased consumption. At midnight, relative to the red line and the yellow line, so right at the far left of the chart, you can see a significant uptick because charging has been deferred to the middle of the night when it wasn't practical to charge in the middle of the day. And in terms of peak time, at the right-hand side, you can see no practical difference between the blue line and the yellow line at peak time. The consumer with an EV is not presenting an increase in peak demand relative to the consumer with solar. And both the consumer with the EV and the consumer with solar are presenting less peak demand than the household with no solar on the roof. These are averages across thousands of consumers. Obviously, as we move towards a future with V2G, that export piece will bias towards more export available at peak time. So we can expect the consumer with V2G at peak time would be below that line rather than above. That's my piece. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the panel.
That was really insightful, and we've seen similar sort of patterns there. And it was interesting as well around some of those incentives that are in place or yet to emerge. But I love the analogy of the marathon there and how we haven't made it to the first drink station yet. Okay, I'll now ask Sayani Gupta from AEMO to join us and share some insights into integrated system planning.
Thank you, C4Net, for inviting me here. I'm very excited to be here and talk about the knowns and unknowns of electric vehicle forecasting. Well, prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future. I think the comical irony of the statement is prediction is always about the future. And when we are thinking about the EV forecasting, there are two ends of the spectrum. At one end, we have the electric vehicle users who are asking questions like, how can I balance my driving needs and costs? I am planning to have a big family. Do I have enough models in the market to choose from? I want to go on longer trips. Do I be anxious that I'll run out of charge and not find a public charging station nearby? On the other hand of the spectrum, there is network, and it's asking questions like, how does EV uptake and charging behavior affect requirements on the network to support customer needs? AEMO, we are at the middle of it and trying to answer what network is asking through long-term forecasting of EV uptake as well as consumption. So by long-term, I mean anything between 1 to 30 years, and long-term forecasting of both EV uptake as well as charging behaviors. There's lots of uncertainty that can be attributed to each of those different factors, and there could be different ways of thinking about it. What we have chosen today is this thinking framework from Donald Rumsfeld's known unknowns matrix. Just at the top left, you can see the known knowns. These are the gold source of information, right? These are the factors that we are aware of. We have certain data on. Moving on to the second quadrant, we have known unknowns, which are factors which we are aware of. We're already estimating, but maybe we can do a better job. So the first and the second quadrant are mostly the factors that can be modeled statistically or mathematically. Moving on to the third one, unknown knowns, which are factors we are not aware of, but could start to estimate if we were. So these are more deeper questions. And we try to estimate them through qualitative and strategic insights. And in the absence of them, we reach out to stakeholders, seek feedback on them, and then improve our estimate and outlook for these factors. And then moving on to unknown knowns. These are the factors we haven't even thought about. And no one is perfect. We are not doing a perfect job in forecasting. But what we want to do when we are doing the long-term forecasting is we want to be at least aware of the factors that might attribute to this uncertainty, and then move on to the known unknowns where we are reasonably estimating them and can become better at them. And finally, reaching this quadrant where we are very certain of reasonably certain of what we are talking about. So examples for each of them. And before I go into that, how to read this text is if you see anything green, that would mean that okay, we are already doing a reasonably good job. It's on track. If it's amber, it would mean that we have considered it. We haven't implemented it yet, but there is a plan that when we will be implementing. And then there's red, right? And these are the development opportunities. And here, when we have gathered here, I would strongly urge everyone to really critically think about these development opportunities and then how we can move on to amber and green. So again, the first quadrant, which is the knowns, we have got road transport data, we've got public charging profile data. We are hoping to get the vehicle registration data, which is great. We have been using the vehicle sales data, but we will be switching to vehicle registration data while also using the vehicle sales data. So that's great. We are moving to a home charging profile, which is the first time we'll be using real sub-meter data instead of relying on the Australian trials for understanding the current charging profile. Yeah, so moving on to the second quadrant, which is the known unknowns. The second one from the top, the NVIS outcome, which is the new vehicle efficiency standard. It's great, and people might argue that, oh, the design of NVIS is all locked in, which would mean that it is a known knowns, but it is not, because it still offers flexibility to vehicle manufacturers, if you see here, and they are given the choice then, and they're asking the question, what mix of vehicles are can I sell to still meet the new vehicle efficiency standard? And it could be that they're meeting the same standard by selling a lot of BEV PHEV or selling a mix of BEV PHEV and hybrid. So there's more clarity, but there's still a little bit of uncertainty around it. The next one is the interactions between consumer energy resources, and this is something we always talk about. As an EV user, I might be less likely to invest on a stationary battery, but I will definitely be interested to buy a solar panel to optimize my charging cost. And in AEMO, we are already having some checks in place to study those kind of interaction, but we do want to move on to a more sophisticated model, which might help to understand those interactions better. The last one is the V2G uptake actuals. This is a really important one, and we are not aware of any plans that are in place to track it as and when they come in. But even when we have tracked the V2G actuals, I think it's a very difficult and incredibly hard to predict, how the uptake rate and timing will be, because a lot of different factors need to be playing together in order to make that happen. For example, the V2G technology needs to roll out. There would be vehicles. How many vehicles would be V2G compatible? If consumers have the appetite to sign up for V2G or not. I think we are gonna hear more about it in the next couple of panel members. But it is a very interesting space. The next one is the unknowns, and yeah, these are the factors that we are not aware of. We can just assume that, yeah, how society chooses to adjust their lifestyles to accommodate the differences between ICE and EVs. Only when data emerges, then we will understand how consumer preferences are emerging from there, and then maybe we will move to the known unknowns. The unknowns, we have seen it in other industries. There has been technological revolutions where Nokia has lost its market to smartphones. Candle makers lost their market share to cheap electric lighting. There has been shocks. Pandemics, coronavirus has changed the dynamics of the economics for 2 years or more. So I think as we have gathered here today, I would, and we want to promote a deeper discussion on this topic. it's really important for us to think about what are the unknowns for this EV space. What are the factors that we are not still considering so that we can move on to the other three quadrants? And how do we think of these development opportunities to basically move from being considered to be on track? All right, questions, comments, feedback, please do write to me or to AEMO directly. We've got enough opportunities for engagement at AEMO, and the link for that is shared here. Thank you so much.
It's such a challenge that you have, but it's a deeply consultative process, and seeing how data can come in and start shifting through. It's a continuous improvement process that sits there in that modelling efforts. So thanks a lot, Sayani. I'd now like to introduce Anna Erceg. Anna's the Manager of Future Networks at AusNet Services. Anna, over to you.
Hi, I'm Anna Erceg from AusNet Services. And I think every DNSP, especially in Australia, is shifting to focus a lot more on the low voltage network and data analytics. And I think that that's come out loud and clear, especially with all DNSPs now working on their EV strategies. And that's really been shaped by, obviously, the rapid transforming landscape, but also the Victorian government's really ambitious renewable energy and decarbonisation goals. So the next slide, I just really want to touch on a few of the key challenges for EV integration across the globe and what we can learn and what we're seeing here in Victoria as well. So infrastructure, performance, and accessibility. So making sure public charging infrastructure meets performance, especially for reliability standards, making sure we can offer that faster charging speeds. How do we address the adoption and the availability of EV infrastructure also in rural and underserved areas on the network? And then how do we manage large-scale EV fleet charging facilities? And they can really reserve a significant part of network capacity, which impacts availability for all other demands and other customers. I was at the All Energy a few weeks ago, and someone gave a really great presentation on how a truck company just decided to buy a massive fleet, which actually required the DNSP to build a new transformer at the zone sub. So, the impacts that DNSPs are seeing is huge. Another thing I want to touch on, so consumer adoption barriers, overcoming challenges like range anxiety. Obviously, AusNet's network is fairly long and rural as well, so addressing those kind of concerns. Limited access to reliable charging options. And then my favorite part, which is really EV integration and network impact. So really assessing and mitigating the impact of EV charging on the grid, including clustering effects. So how do we proactively address things like hosting capacity constraints, but also impacts on network assets and asset utilization. Really improving visibility of domestic EV usage profiles to understand and also anticipate charging behaviors. And how do we really develop strategies for a lot of this early adoption of smart charging functionality, and how can that help us manage the network demand more efficiently? Technology and I guess strategy maturity. At the moment, there is a level of maturity in EV and smart charging strategies, but how do we make sure that we coordinate and manage the network impacts better for that? And then obviously, as we were just listening to before, how do we enhance that forecasting accuracy to predict, where the EVs will be connecting and on what part of the networks, and really avoid underestimating the demand, as we've seen in some other countries. Policy, supply, and market dynamics, definitely a challenge for DNSPs is navigating aggressive government decarbonisation policies, which is great, but how do we make sure the network's capacity, resources, and also technical capabilities align with both, transport of electrification for residential customers, but also larger scale. Things like impacts of supply chain constraints, that also impacts forecasts, and I guess our ability to mitigate those. On the next slide, still on this slide, my bad. Across AusNet's network, I just wanted to quickly touch on, so we're expecting that EVs will go from around 11,000 in 2024 to anywhere up to 245,000 in 2031, which is aligned to the Victorian government target. So this chart just shows that split between residential EVs and commercial, such as buses. The anticipated growth in demand from EVs will lead to capacity and also reliability constraints on all voltage levels of the network. So by 2031, AusNet's expecting an increase to maximum demand driven by all forms of electrification will be around 147 megawatts, with 113 megawatts being due to EVs and 34 being due to electrification of gas load. So this result also assumes that 5% of the total EV fleet will be under some form of management or orchestration. This assumption really reflects a lot of the customer feedback, indicating a reluctance for that widespread third-party management of EV charging. I thought I just wanted to also touch on that solar uptake. Early forecasts show that solar adoption is expected to remain stable, but really the battery and EV uptake, we're anticipating to see a significant increase. A quick note, EV data collection. So currently we do not collect specific data on consumers with electric vehicles. A data collection is limited only to exporting inverter-based technologies, so your solar panels and your batteries, and the Energy Security Board's reviewing that policies for EV data collection. So that could enable a lot more comprehensive insights in the future. On the next slide, how do we address some of these risks? Supply and service delays. If we don't deliver timely network upgrades, we could disrupt electricity supply, delaying customers' ability to purchase or charge EVs. Obviously, this is a big risk to DNSP's reputational damage and loss of social trust. Customer dissatisfaction, inadequate charging availability may frustrate customers, increasing compliance risks, potential penalties. Equity issues, how do we make sure that, equal access to both reliable electricity supply between regional and urban customers, with regional customers being disproportionately affected. So how do we manage that? Funding challenges without strategic planning. How do we make sure that we secure the sufficient funding for upgrades to really handle the growing load for EVs so that it doesn't impact future operations? And I think I just want to spend some more time on innovation. So I might go to the next slide before I run out of time. One of the things that AusNet's doing at the moment is an EV tariff trial, understanding EV charge response for pricing signals, understanding how customers respond to additional incentives, and if we can really encourage certain EV charging behaviour on maximum or also minimum demand days, and really just gathering the evidence and efficiency to prove whether the effectiveness of these event-based tariffs. Customer research, a lot of the customer research engagement has been really eye-opening. One of the key insights that we had in 2023 when AusNet hosted a public webinar was that more than 20% of households intend to purchase an EV in the next 5 years, with residential solar customers who are exporting energy already being more likely to purchase EVs. A lot of this early adopter cohort, I guess, are the key drivers for that. And this finding is consistent with what we're experiencing internationally as well. An exciting one is the EV pole-mounted curbside chargers. So AusNet recently kicked off a new project to create designs and standards for pole-mounted EV chargers. So they've been trialled and successful in New South Wales. However, the designs have to be reviewed and obviously revised to be compliant with Victorian standards. So we're in the process of doing this. Suitable locations for poles is a fun time, making sure that you've got network loading conditions, solar penetration, finding a suitable pole, making sure there's street parking availability and EV traffic. And then, like I mentioned before, how do you navigate those rural areas? So we're also looking at, holiday destinations and making sure we find some good bakeries where we could put a charger around. Another thing we're working on is EV charge detection algorithms. So there's been a lot of work done in this space. Obviously, we want to understand where customers have EVs in which home. And I think I just wanted to point out that it takes about 7 minutes to run 1 year of data for one customer. And AusNet's got over 820,000 smart meter data points. So that's a lot of computer power if we were to run this, I guess, across the network. And it's great to have data, but sometimes, to run this extensive, these algorithms and this extensive analysis, that requires a lot of computer power. Another thing we're working is with new estates. So we're collaborating with developers. How can we better manage greenfield developments and future-proof infrastructure for EV-wide adoption? So I think I've run out of time, so that's a quick wrap up of my EVs for Networks 101. So let's keep the wheel turning and work together and navigate this electrifying future. Thank you.
It's such a challenge for DNSPs, and that we're asking you to do it with your eyes closed and not fully aware EVs are actually connected and everything. So there's some opportunities there. And even, I found myself reacting to when you said, the difference in New South Wales and Victoria pole standards and things like that. That's a lot of work to go through. Do we really need this? We have to find some ways to simplify it and try and make it a bit easier. Our next speaker will talk to a challenge then that's such an opportunity as well, and this is around the vehicle to grid, vehicle to home, all the variants of that, and Jon can narrow in on which bits he's going to focus on. So Jon Sibley from NX, please welcome.
So really, we've been sort of deep diving into this bidirectional EV charging space for the last 18 months or so. First of all, what is bidirectional EV charging? So all those things we talked about the scale of EV uptake and the load on the grid and how we can manage those has a very fortunate upside, which is that the batteries in these vehicles can work in both directions, and they can help us shift renewable energy through space and time. The three types of bidirectional EV charging are set out here. The one that captures the most imagination is obviously vehicle to grid. So really important that our terminology, is aligned. So vehicle to grid in international parlance means it's electrically connected to the grid. It doesn't mean you're exporting to the grid. You could just be self-consuming to, offset your evening peak demand, etc. But it means it's coupled with the grid frequency, and it needs to meet all the relevant standards associated with coupling to the grid. Vehicle to home building is very valuable for consumers. It means they can run a shed that's not electrically connected, or they can use a backup power supply when the grid is down and all those kinds of things. But it's overall a lower value use case in the energy transition. Vehicle to load just means that you can plug a camping fridge into your car or a power tool. Extremely valuable in certain use cases, but really the focus for us at the moment is on this vehicle to grid use case. So AEMO has estimated that by 2050, to balance out all the renewables and to meet our the load forecasts under the step change scenario, we'll need 640 gigawatt hours of electrical storage by 2050. The aggregate capacity of our EV fleet is going to be about 2,300 gigawatt hours, nearly 4 times the total NEM energy storage requirement. If we can tap in even to a small proportion of that, that's going to deliver huge savings in the form of reduced large-scale investment costs, network augmentation, fuel burn from gas, during those periods where we're reliant on gas for backup, and ultimately that will contribute to reduced emissions. My own views have become much more bullish over the last 18 months in terms of the potential for this. Talking to automakers and supply chain stakeholders in Australia and internationally, there's absolutely no reason why we can't do with vehicles what we did with solar, and there's no reason why by just say 2040 we couldn't have 4 million vehicles on the road providing these services. So these are vehicles that will have batteries probably on average of around 70 to 80 kilowatt hours, connected to the grid a significant proportion of the time, and providing services of solar soaking and dispatch to support the grid during demand peaks. So a number of factors are going to determine how available these vehicles are to provide these services. The first being obviously automakers need to release this capacity and need to make products available to consumers. That's starting to happen with mass market product releases in Europe and in the US. Australia is going to trail that. How attractive can we make our market to automakers to release this capability? That's a key question for policymakers at the moment. Customer uptake, obviously there's got to be value for customers in that. This is going to be determined by, through the market, primarily through the productization choices of automakers and retailers and aggregators and other people that are sort of helping customers realize the value of these products. Transport and plug-in behavior is also really critical. So we know that EVs are not plugged in a lot of the time, especially during those commuting hours and during the day. So on the right-hand side, you can see a couple of models that we've run where we look at under different kinds of charging behavior scenarios, different plug-in behavior scenarios, what the capacity availability is like across the NEM. Up the top, you can see over time, a really wide oscillation. So the height of the green band there, for example, is the oscillation between likely to be plugged in overnight and unlikely to be plugged in during the day. And as the total fleet size grows, the wedge starts to grow upwards there. In the bottom one, where we have a lot more, say, public charging infrastructure or workplace charging infrastructure, we have autonomous vehicles which are automatically charging off the sun during the day, or if we have more work from home, or for whatever reason we have more daytime charging, you can see that that band really tightens up. That's a much more economically efficient outcome if we're able to achieve it, because we'll increase the overall availability of vehicles to provide these services, but will also increase the extent to which they can charge at the lowest price times of the day. Smart grid integration is critical. Flexible export limits will open up export capacity during the evening peaks, and all networks across the NEM are certainly in the mainland have plans to implement dynamic operating envelopes using our national protocol CCBOS. That's a real positive. And then finally, on this slide, in order to effectively value this resource, we need to move towards dynamic network tariffs. So that's tariffs that fully value the services that bidirectional EVs can provide when the grid needs it, and don't just incentivize daily cycling of the battery through time of use tariffs, which obviously are not great for the battery and tend to undervalue the dispatch of those batteries during those critical peak times. So, where is the market at? Internationally, everyone's shifting from trials. People are sort of largely done with trials now. It's about mainstream product development. So they're looking at how do we develop this into an attractive consumer value proposition that manages the risks to all the different parties, that provides a simple proposition that customers can buy into, and ultimately provide automakers with a competitive advantage in the market. We suspect that virtually all automakers are currently working on this. Obviously, these are very commercially sensitive decisions about the timing of these product releases, but there is huge interest across certainly all the automakers that we engaged with through our research. So the focus now is on turning it into products. It's homologating it for end markets. So that means making sure they can comply with local grid code conditions or interoperability requirements or whatever standards apply in the end markets. Over on the right, you can see there's just examples of vehicles that have been demonstrated to be bidirectionally capable. Effectively, every vehicle is capable of DC bidirectional charging. But for AC bidirectional charging, there are a number of vehicles capable, but they're a little bit further, a little bit more work to do to get them standards compliant in end markets. So just on this slide,
have a look at these pictures.
Oh, Google is searching for me, something in the background. So there's a lot going on here. Probably just 2 points to make. Firstly, there are these global technical standards. So in the green on the left, that we're going to be reliant on in our market. CHAdeMO is obviously being phased out and being replaced with CCS. CCS can support bidirectional charging, but with the particular interoperability standard ISO 15118-20. Again, with OCPP, we need the latest version of that, OCPP 2.1. These are relatively new standards, and they're not widely available across the market. Australia is also implementing IEEE 23.5, CCPOS, and AS4777. These are not widely used internationally. And so there are special requirements for our market. And you can see on the right, whether it's an AC or a DC bidirectional charging configuration impacts what needs to be certified for local market conditions. And an AC vehicle to grid, both the charger and the vehicle needs to get grid code certification. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jon. It's a really interesting insight into V2G, and it's such a critical piece because it can put that X factor, the swing, so much in there in terms of the planning challenge that is there. I'll actually ask all of the speakers now just to pop your cameras on, please, and we'll come back together. There was a range of things that we just heard then, and it was really interesting hearing around the standards challenge that's there as well, for not only the grid, but also the vehicle makers themselves, the role of Australia being a tiny market within the global context, and how that's going to play out and be a bit of a challenge. So look, thank you to all our presenters there, and there's some great questions starting to come through in the Q&A, and I encourage, please, the audience members, please keep throwing those to us, and we're going to get to those in really short time. Sayani, if I could just come to you first, and then please the rest of the panel chime in as you think. Cast us forward just to 2050 for a moment. You've got a whole lot of things balancing in the grid there. What is the role of EVs? How would you characterize that?
Great question. I think every one of us is very, very keen to know where is EVs going. And we at AEMO has a scenario-based approach to best deal with this uncertainty. We don't know which scenario is gonna eventuate, but then we are we make the principles very, very transparent, that what are the inputs and assumptions that will lead to a particular scenario. So the highest scenario that we have is the green energy export scenario, and we see that by 2050, almost all the vehicles on the road will be EVs. So that's the saturation point where we say that, yes, most of the fleet would be EVs. And the lower end of the scenario, we have the saturation point reaching much after 2050. So we see around 60% of the fleet to be EVs. And the central scenario, which is the step change, is somewhere in between that. Now, how that affects the energy consumption is really how the EV users are charging and where they're taking the electricity from, really. So they can charge from the solar panels, or from their batteries, or from the charging station, and the dynamics of how all of these different factors play out will finally tell us really that what would be the exact energy consumption that we will see. But as I said, we are doing it at a scenario-based approach, and we think that 20% of the underlying consumption would be for EV driving.
20%. Okay, so it's massive, and we've got electrification going on of gas and everything at the same time, and a real localized impact, I would have thought, in certainly what we're seeing through the ESP, like where Anna brought out the correlation, and Ross mentioned the correlation with solar and everything as well, and home generation, and how consumers are going there. I guess moving from that, did anyone else want to comment before I move on? No, maybe Ross and Anna, in terms of 20% increase, how do we plan for that, both in terms of managing consumers, informing consumers, and Ross, you touched on there some of the first pricing or the regimes that you're promoting, and Anna, you touched on the tariff structure, but also the incentives that you're looking at from trying to get consumers to change better. How do we prepare consumers for that? Maybe Ross, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, James. So I guess the first principles bit is the consumers need access to the sorts of signals that are going to create the behavior that we want. This might be by orchestration, it might be by pricing. There's a raft of different ways it can be achieved, but the goal is to make it desirable on the part of the consumer to make the change. We shouldn't naturally assume that consumers will be willing to give up amenity in exchange for delivering good outcomes for the energy system. The natural assumption will be consumers will look first to what is convenient for them, and then assuming that what is convenient with them can be aligned with what's good for the energy system, then we're potentially on a winner. In Victoria, where I'm sitting now, and certainly in most of the rest of the country, there's already widespread access to tariff products at a retail level that will support consumers making the right choice. And we're already seeing uptake of tens of thousands of consumers gravitating to those products and behaving accordingly. There's some work to do in some parts of the country where access to those retail products doesn't exist, largely on account of absence of a competitive retail market. And then underpinning those retail products are network products, because the retail product that the consumer sees is built on top of the wholesale price and the network tariff. So if we've got these things working together towards a common goal, we're more likely to get to where we need to get to. I'll stop there and throw to, I think, Anna was your next pick to speak to this one, James?
I think from the DNSP perspective, the first thing that comes to mind is thermal overloads of assets, your conductors, your transformers requiring more costly upgrades. And then now we've also got challenges with minimum demand as well. So when we look at CER, you can't just look at EVs specifically, you have to look at solar as well. And I think one of the most interesting things for us at the moment is we can't just keep upgrading infrastructure, because consumers choose how they use their electricity more and more. And that real shift from DNSPs kind of just building up the network to now having to really analyze and use data to understand how consumers will charge EVs or use their solar, or kind of all around the consumer behavior. And I think that if that's not addressed, then, with both EV demands and also our minimum system load issues, the grid will just become more and more difficult to manage. So really leveraging, the more data we can leverage, the better forecast we have, the better. And also getting more feedback from consumers on how they want to use their EVs and if they will actually respond to those tariffs, because some of the customers that we've talked to initially have said they're not interested in saving an extra, X amount of dollars a week, because they want to charge when they want to charge. So how do we bridge that gap between, well, we want to avoid costly upgrades to keep bills down, but if consumers aren't willing, to work with us or, work on orchestration, then, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place kind of thing. So, in today's session, definitely giving me a few things to think about. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I reckon that compounds when you get to V2G, and I recognise that there's consumers who are going to want to be really active, but there's the vast majority we know want a very, very, very passive in their electricity choices and everything, and just really want their needs just served with low activity. So, Jon, with that, looking at that V2G, and given that there's that uncertainty around consumers, thinking then back to what's our role in making that easy for them, or at least available, so that if they do want to go, any thoughts there?
Well, yeah, I mean, ultimately it has to be consumers' choice, right, as to whether or not they participate in these kinds of markets. And I mean, there is a value there on the table, and competitive market operation will try and refine products that make them more appealing to customers, make them more valuable. I think that that we can't. It's not something that we can force on consumers, but we can enable more choice and control by consumers by making it easier for products to enter our market, to provide to make sure that the incentives frameworks that we have for network pricing, in particular, are appropriately valuing the services that these technologies can provide. There is a lot we can do around setting clear direction at a national level around standards and minimum interoperability standards, in particular behind the meter. That can make it easier for consumers to engage in these products over time. You got to remember that this isn't happening in a greenfields context. A lot of consumers will be buying an EV, and after they've got solar already, they might even have a battery. And so for them to be able to participate in the grid services, these things need to interoperate behind the meter. They need to be able to talk to each other. And we don't have any requirements in Australia at the moment that these things can actually talk to each other such that they can be orchestrated effectively. So there's a lot we can do to lay the groundwork for a positive consumer experience, so that the market can work and this value can be shared throughout the value chain.
Yeah, I was listening to one of your recent podcasts, and you're talking through some of that complexity, and it sounds like there's a lot, but it's good to know that it's being tackled as well, and seeing the or hearing of the formation of the EV roadmap and everything as well is really, or V2G roadmap, is really pleasing to hear. Will that tackle some of these challenges or prioritise some of them?
Yeah, that's right. So I think we're talking about ARENA and Race for 2030 funding the development of a roadmap, which will be presented to energy ministers. Very much the roadmap's objective is to bring forward this opportunity for Australian consumers and do it well, so that we're delivering the best outcome for all stakeholders. So we've done a lot of research and engagement. We had a really great workshop in Canberra last week with a number of stakeholders and supply chain participants. And at the moment we're sort of filtering down all the great ideas into those that we think are might form a actionable package for governments to take forward.
A natural segue, Ross, I think for you was one that came up around consumers understanding the complexity of home EV charging scenarios with or without solar and battery, and how to choose the best options for them.
Thanks, James. Yeah, very good question, and one that at the EV Council we get all the time. We touched on numbers before. There's about 250,000 people driving EVs today. The vast majority of these people, more than 90% of them, charge their cars at home. So lots and lots of Australians have tackled this question and answered it to their own satisfaction. But providing that guidance to people who are thinking about an EV, whose previous experience is only ever been a petrol or diesel vehicle, it comes up regularly. Very, very high frequency question for the people that are selling the cars. Someone in a standalone home, so if you've got a driveway or a garage at your house, especially if you're an owner-occupier, so you've got the freedom to install whatever you wish, subject to electrical regulations and requirements, for you, it's pretty easy. You can plug into the existing 10-amp power point on the wall. For most drivers, that'll be adequate. You can install a simple EV charger, something orchestrated if you like, and that'll meet your needs. If you're in an apartment complex, then you're going to need to work through your owner's corporation, and that is going to be more complicated. The old line from Tolstoy applies here, right? Happy families are all the same. Unhappy families are unhappy in different ways. Apartment complexes can tend towards being unhappy families with respect to retrofitting for EV charging. Not that it can't be done, it's just more complicated. And then you've got a cohort of people, perhaps 7% of the population, whose dwelling stock doesn't include off-street parking. So those folks are going to need public in the charging domain or solutions like curbside charging. It is going to vary. This is not a silver bullet kind of a problem. It's a silver buckshot kind of a problem. The EVC, for the records, produced a home charging guide that's available on our website. I'll talk to James about possibly circulating that afterwards in answer to this question. And I might stop it there. Anyone who wants to hit me up on LinkedIn to talk about it more, feel free.
And we'll pop that. We'll try and continue the conversation on LinkedIn afterwards. And so please do engage through there, but we will try and make sure we send that link to everyone as well. There was quite a few comments there in the, we sort of wrapped up into a couple of questions, and Sayani, I'm going to actually get this first one to you. And then it was general, there was a couple around the impact of energy generation and storage becoming more localized. And with most of the people doing their charging at home, as Ross just mentioned, then what is that impact? I'm coming to you because you mentioned about looking at individual chart demand profiles, and that's from an integrated system point of view, you're getting right down to individual. What's that sort of challenge for you?
So we do have to, move to individual consumer lifestyle centric profiles somehow. And at AEMO, we get a lot of feedbacks that so we have got the popularity of different charging types. So people can charge at home, away from home, within when they're charging at home, they can take advantage of middle of the day tariffs or overnight tariffs. And our assumptions on V2G, V2H capability as well. And we do get a lot of feedback on that the way we are assuming unscheduled charging, which is just flat tariff, is to be questioned, but it's very contradictory. So we need to have evidence, right? We need to judge everything based on evidence or evidence that will be emerging, and then only we can change our assumptions. So this time we have actually changed our assumption based on some of the data that AER has published, and we have considerably reduced our outlook on the amount of unscheduled charging people will be doing. So people will be actually moving towards time of use charging is our assumption. So we are still doing it at an aggregate level, because at AEMO we do it at an aggregate level, but more and more people are asking, okay, we understand that it's very diverse. We are living in a very diverse world, but still there can be consumer archetypes that can be built, which together can help answer the question that if more people are belonging in that archetype who are charging in the evening peak, then we have to talk about infrastructure expansion and whatnot, and if they can be brought in the middle of the day to be able to use that, best use the cheap power during solar hours. So we are definitely thinking about it and constantly changing our assumptions depending on data that's published. So I think it's a great platform to also request everyone that the data that we're not taking into consideration or that's emerging, please come back to us with feedback.
Well, certainly we're working on that within the ESP project as well, in that localization. But for those that don't know, AEMO in their ISP have a fantastic consultation process and very rigid set timeframes and everything as to how you can access and get put forward views and also data sets and everything. And so please have a look at their website on that, because it's a great way that you can contribute to that. Looking at then, there's a couple of questions in there around the sort of middle of the day charging. How do we help the grid? Where a car is going to be, and also other big loads on the grid, such as data centers and everything. And then how do we think of those together? Anna, is any of that coming through at the moment in DNSP longer term planning and thinking about maybe commuter hubs? And everything where cars are stationary during the day, but not necessarily at home?
I think it's easiest in greenfields or new connections where we know where something's coming. So, like I mentioned before, some of the newer states that we're looking at, we can explore things like demand responsive devices, managing charging pattern through virtual power plants and things like that. But where we don't hear from councils, or where we don't hear from communities who are looking to put these EV charge spots, our visibility kind of limits our ability to plan, I think I'd say is probably one of the key concerns. So for greenfields, especially when developers want to work with us, we can really do some interesting and innovative things. And I think someone mentioned in the chat, the backstop mechanism, that's something that we're looking at. If we, instead of upping up the cost to connect new greenfields, can we use something like an OCPP or something for EVs, so we can allow a greater demand in the area, instead of just upgrading the network or charging developers, I guess, more for kiosks and bigger conductors essentially. But for brownfields, existing areas of the network, it's really hard to detect where that might be coming up. So we do our best with the forecasts. And like I said, with these EV charge detection algorithms, we can start to see on an individual home base where the customers may be. But to run that across the network of 820,000 customers and then overlay maybe where there might be charging hubs and things like that without information coming to us, it's going to be, it definitely is a challenge. And that's why that community consultation and working together with retailers, and, you know, that's vital.
Is it the type of thing that you can see, you know, EV connection points being added to the DER register or something like that?
There are for large connections, but I think you know, as we're seeing, it's the homes that'll pose the biggest challenge.
Okay. Everyone wants to, you know, on V2G, when, you know, this is, and how big is a couple of questions coming through. Jon, could you paint us a picture what you think's going to be happening over the next 5 years, say, and then Ross, you may have some views as well to share.
Yeah, so we tested what we call a market objective, which is that by 2030, consumers have access to a competitive market of different vehicles and different chargers that are capable of bidirectional charging, and that by 2027, there's at least several products available. We tested that with international supply chain stakeholders. That was, I think, universally endorsed as being achievable, but it may not happen. And the reason it may not happen is because our market is quite small. It's seen as fragmented with a bunch of different DNSP requirements. We haven't set a clear vision for our for our overall smart grid architecture development. There's some uncertainty by OEMs as to how that'll unfold. And overall, a number of OEMs appear to be taking sort of wait and see approach with the Australian market. We're not at the top of their list internationally. But we have the potential to be at the top of the list. We have some really good fundamentals, very dynamic wholesale market, strong consumer engagement in CER technologies. Relatively, EV uptake is definitely picking up compared to a lot of economies. So we have the potential to bump ourselves up that list and achieve those sort of market objectives. Again, that's really a question for sort of national policy. It's something where DNSPs have a really big role to play in enabling, making our market more attractive with nationally harmonized requirements and, appropriate incentives through the sort of tariff arrangements. So yeah, it's really in our hands. I think we could well see in the next 12 months CCS-based products coming to our market, but it's not clear. And honestly, I don't think any automaker has a concrete plan to release that capability in our market at the moment.
In terms of potential scale, I might speak to that first. If we think about how many EVs are likely to be on the road at 2030, so I'll lump in there battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids. We call it an EV if you can plug it in. In the EVC's lexicon, driving around in a hybrid that's entirely fueled by petrol doesn't count. But it's the EVs, the plug-in hybrids and the BEVs that are potentially going to be able to do V2G. They're the ones that will be designed such that they might be able to export. If there's 2.5 million of those on the road at 2030, and we allow for perhaps 5% of them doing V2G at that time, so one vehicle in 20 belongs to a consumer that has decided, yep, V2G is a thing that I want to do. That's about 125,000 vehicles. If you assume that V2G capability is at about the same kind of level as the solar inverters that are in our homes today, so in the 5 to 10 kilowatt kind of range, you're talking about an export capability in the 500 to 1,000 megawatt range. So upper limit of maybe about a gigawatt of dispatchable capacity at 2030 from V2G, if the stars align and we get it all right. The longer term question, though, is that's off the back of 125,000 cars out of the 2.5 million that are on the road at 2030. Longer term, we're not talking about 2.5 million cars, and we're certainly not talking about only 5% of consumers do it. The upper limit here is how many gigawatts would you like at peak time from V2G? In terms of how quickly can we get there, picking up on Jon's question around it being a national policy piece, I would reflect on how fast solar went when it became a national policy objective to do it. So in 2006, there were about 1,100 rooftop solar installations executed. 5 years later, we had 350,000 rooftop solar installations executed. And it's been tootling along at 250 to 350,000 installations every year since. My challenge is, it looks very much like V2G in 2025 is the equivalent of solar in 2005, 2006. If we want this to go really, really fast, all the building blocks are there. It's a question of choice as to how quick we'd like to go.
That's a really, really interesting viewpoint, and how that will align with all those the standards barriers and how quickly we can move through those so that we align internationally will be pretty interesting. Super exciting, though. But actually, the uncertainty of it then provides quite a complexity for the planners who are there, because it can swing just so big, and the infrastructure builders. There's a really interesting question here around, can we think over the last 50 years of a parallel consumer purchase that is there, that parallels the emergence of EVs in terms of complexity, impact, learning curve, lifestyle impacts, and infrastructure requirements, and whether any learnings. I was reflecting the other day and trying to explain V2G to somebody. It's kind of like we've got our cars now, and imagine that with petrol prices changing, because we know people move around to different petrol prices and change their buying behavior on petrol prices that are there. But if you could now unload your tank when you see a high price and get a credit, and then pull it back in when you want, and everything, it's kind of equivalent of that. We can't even imagine such a world. So it's actually quite difficult for us, and how quickly we normalize to that new world is unknown. Can you think? Does anyone have any thoughts of a parallel?
Well, the first thing that came to my mind is just like superannuation, right? It goes along in the background. You don't really have to think about it too much, but it's contributing wealth to your long-term wealth and security, financial security at the individual level, as well as national prosperity. So hopefully that's where it gets to. It doesn't really need much of the consumer, other than periodically when you buy a car, choosing one that does this. There are some requirements on behavior. So the more you plug in the vehicle, the greater the revenue opportunity. So products in trials in Europe, for example, have had specific incentives for plugging in more often. But other than that, there really doesn't require any change in social practices or any great change in consumer behavior.
In the energy sector, there's been waves of new things that have come in, waves of new kinds of assets that have turned up in the domestic home. We can look at electric storage, hot water, and that's much more than 50 years. That's been around a good bit longer than that, but it's got similarity in that it is a very large load, which can be time shifted if you throw a little bit of technology and consumer preference at it. Air conditioning came in next. Solar came in after that, and each of these had big systemic impacts through the deployment of millions of units of this kind. So EV is going to be similar to those in some ways and different in others. One of the risks here is preparing to fight the last war. So if we assume that EVs are going to look just like solar, or they're going to look just like air conditioning, we will be incorrect in interesting ways. Right? It's important to understand how these things might be the same, but equally how they might be different. In terms of the quantum, I don't think there's any new kind of consumer asset that we have brought into the energy system that has resulted in a 40% uplift in total energy requirement across the country. Air conditioning maybe, but we're talking about something that is systemically very, very large. This shift to EVs is going to mean more generation assets, more transmission assets, all manner of things are going to need to be brought to bear in order to bring this off well.
Great point. And Cornelius in the audience has raised as well the parallel with just smartphone technologies and how that's changed that telephone from something we speak on to something that we can't live without as an integral way of integrating into a whole lot of other things that we do in our day-to-day. I'm conscious that we're coming towards the end and we've still got quite a few questions there. So I'm going to ask for a couple of quick fire answers here from my panelists. I'm just going to try and run through some questions here. What data do you think is the biggest missing piece that you'd like that would enable us to better understand current and future states of play for EV to grid integration?
I don't think we're really missing any data. It's just the analytics of the data that we have. We have smart meter data, luckily, smart meter information in Victoria, luckily. So it would be nice to know when someone's connected an EV charger.
I would add to that the amount of home charging versus public charging, if there is public information on it, and how people are taking in different tariff incentives and changing their behavior. So the data on tariffs and which tariffs they are on, and then how they're charging behavior, all of this together might help us to really have a clear understanding of their behavior.
Question here around smart meters, which is very close to our thinking and at our hearts here at C4Net. So are we able to utilise the current smart meters on residential properties to help encourage smart charging at times and support the grid and better utilise available solar energy? I'm going to add to it by saying, and how should we be thinking of upgrading smart meters over time, as in the standards that are there to enable or facilitate V2G or other scheduled charging type things?
Short answer, yes. A smart meter is an enabler for smart behaviour on the part of the consumer, because the smart meter is how you present the consumer with a time of use tariff. Not saying you can't do other things as well, but a smart meter is a core enabler. Fantastic. We've got them ubiquitous in Victoria. Great to see the rollout continuing in other places.
Just to add that the move to 5-minute settlement, retail settlement, will also be a further enabler. Obviously, Victoria's a little bit stuck on that one, but most of the meters in the rest of the country are capable of 5-minute metrology.
Are the current standards okay, or can you see upgrades to meters that we might need, including potential control mechanisms?
I think one of the biggest challenges we're seeing is Wi-Fi and access to internet when we want to do some of these smart orchestration things, and some of the trials have shown that, and given AusNet's network, a lot of it is rural. I think that's a challenge that we've got, telecommunication and the 4G headend stuff. Yeah.
So the communication infrastructure as well as the meter infrastructure that's there. Could any of the panel members share their views on the potential of DNSP controlling EVs connected to the grids via some compulsory grid support mechanisms such as the backstop?
I think I'd just say things like flexible exports that we're doing, sometimes there are customer apprehension to sign up to things like this. There's a lot of, I guess, work to do in customer education on the difference between control and optimization. Customers do not like the word control. In the green fields, yes, that is something we can do because we can work with the developer and the builders. However, in existing parts of the network, that is really difficult, is what I'd say.
Okay, got to be really quick now with these. So have we explored non-financial incentives or the potential impacts on behaviour? So we've talked about plans and everything, but have we seen any non-financial impacts? Incentives.
I can speak to that. So consumers who have their own solar on the roof of their house know that their own solar is the greenest form of energy. We're talking about a population of people who are making a vehicle choice with an environmental outlook. A lot of these people will use the solar on their roof because of the environmental angle, not just the dollars one.
Excellent. And that's been reflected in a few things. Look, I would like to thank everybody for both attending today, your interest in this. Please do share the links afterwards. I'd particularly like to thank the panelists for their contribution here. I've learned something. I'd actually like to ask each of you just to take a moment to reflect on something that you've heard from today's discussion. But I do thank you very much. Ross?
So reflecting on Sayani's point about known knowns and known unknowns and unknown unknowns, the Donald Rumsfeldian piece, I think there's an awful lot for us to do collectively around which things might be known knowns to some of us, but known unknowns to others. Working together and making sure that we're sharing that information in order to bring us collectively to a state where more of these things are progressing towards being known knowns for everyone that needs to know.
Yeah, there's a lot of good discussion, but I really liked that how EVC is having a product where for each regions we will be able to know that what are the EV incentivized tariffs. So I thought that was very important. I didn't know about it and would want to include that in work.
Yes, I'd also like to talk about the Donald Rumsfeld quote, and I'd like to raise Ross's Tolstoy reference and reference the Marxist psychoanalyst philosopher Slavoj Žižek, who drew attention to this concept of the unknown knowns. But he called them assumptions that are so deeply rooted in ideology we don't even know that we know them. And I think EVs really challenge the whole paradigm of power system management. The flip to distributed resources of this scale is completely unparalleled, and we really need to catch up our thinking and open our minds to how we can make use of this.
I think Ross's point about customers wanting both discounts and control over their EVs just really emphasises how important it is for consumers, DNSPs, retailers and government to work together on that education, the incentives to make sure that we're aligning that behaviour. But also, I think we didn't really touch on it today, but we can't forget customers with different socioeconomic levels, and we can't forget them along the energy transition journey.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. This is the last of our series for this year. We will come back next year with 3 more in this series. And then from a C4Net perspective, we'll be bringing as well the results of ESP planning and how that moves to whole of system. Thanks all. Thanks for your time.